Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Secretary Blinken, who will speak to the Department's International Religious Freedom Report. We will then hear from Office of International Religious Freedom Senior Official Dan Nadel, who will be happy to take your questions on this year's report. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Secretary Blinken.
Ned, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So let me start, first of all, by wishing everyone a good morning and Eid Mubarak to all who are celebrating. Before talking about the report, I want to just take a minute to discuss what's happening in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. We're deeply concerned about what we're seeing there. Images that came out overnight are harrowing, and the loss of any civilian life is a tragedy. I've asked Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Hadi Amr to go to the region immediately to meet with Israeli and Palestinian leaders. He will bring to bear his decades of experience, and in particular, he will urge on my behalf and on behalf of President Biden a de-escalation of violence. We are very focused on this. The United States remains committed to a two-state solution. This violence takes us further away from that goal. We fully support Israel's legitimate right to defend itself. We've condemned, and I condemn again, the rocket attacks in the strongest possible terms. We believe Palestinians and Israelis equally deserve to live with safety and security. And we'll continue to engage with Israelis, Palestinians, and other regional partners to urge de-escalation and to bring calm. The State Department is releasing the 2020 International Religious Freedom Report. We produce this document every year for 23 years. It offers a comprehensive review of the state of religious freedom in nearly 200 countries and territories around the world. And it reflects the collective effort of literally hundreds of American diplomats around the world and our Office of International Religious Freedom here in Washington, led by Dan Nadel. And he'll be taking some questions from you today on the report. Let me just say a few words about why this report matters. Religious freedom is a human right. In fact, it goes to the heart of what it means to be human, to think freely, to follow our conscience, to change our beliefs if our hearts and minds lead us to do so, to express those beliefs in public and in private. This freedom is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's also part of the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Our country's commitment to defending freedom of religion and belief goes back centuries. It continues today. Religious freedom, like every human right, is universal. All people, everywhere, are entitled to it, no matter where they live, what they believe, or what they don't believe. Religious freedom is co-equal with other human rights because human rights are indivisible. Religious freedom is not more or less important than the freedom to speak and assemble, to participate in the political life of one's country, to live free from torture or slavery, or any other human right. Indeed, they're all interdependent. Religious freedom can't be fully realized unless other human rights are respected. And when governments violate their people's right to believe and worship freely, it jeopardizes all the others. And religious freedom is a key element of an open and stable society. Without it, people aren't able to make their fullest contribution to their country's success. And whenever human rights are denied, it ignites tension, it breeds division. As this year's International Religious Freedom Report indicates, for many people around the world, this right is still out of reach. In fact, according to the Pew Research Center, 56 countries, encompassing a significant majority of the world's people, have high or severe restrictions on religious freedom. To name just a few examples from this year's report, Iran continues to intimidate, harass, and arrest members of minority faith groups, including Baha'i, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, Sunni, and Sufi Muslims. In Burma, the military coup leaders are among those responsible for ethnic cleansing and other atrocities against Rohingya, most of whom are Muslim, and other religious and ethnic minorities around the world. In Russia, authorities continue to harass, detain, and seize property of Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as members of Muslim minority groups, on the pretense of alleged extremism. In Nigeria, courts continue to convict people of blasphemy, sentencing them to long-term imprisonment or even death. Yet the government has still not brought anyone to justice for the military's massacre of hundreds of Shia Muslims in 2015. Saudi Arabia remains the only country in the world without a Christian church, though there are more than 1 million Christians living in Saudi Arabia. And authorities continue to jail human rights activists like Raif Badawi, who was sentenced in 2014 to a decade in prison and 1,000 lashes for speaking about his beliefs. And China broadly criminalizes religious expression and continues to commit crimes against humanity and genocide against Muslim Uyghurs and members of other religious and ethnic minority groups. Today, I'm announcing the designation of Yu Wei, former office director of the so-called Central Leading Group Preventing and Dealing with Heretical Religions of Chengdu, for his involvement in gross violations of human rights, namely the arbitrary detention of Falun Gong practitioners. Yu Wei and his family are now ineligible for entry into the United States. I could go on. The examples are far too numerous. More broadly, we're seeing anti-Semitism on the rise worldwide, including here in the United States, as well as across Europe. It's a dangerous ideology that history has shown is often linked with violence. We must vigorously oppose it wherever it occurs. Anti-Muslim hatred is still widespread in many countries, and this too is a serious problem for the United States as well as in Europe. We have work to do to ensure that people of all faiths and backgrounds are treated with equal dignity and respect. As this report notes, some countries have taken positive steps forward, and that too deserves comment. Last year, the civilian-led transitional government in Sudan repealed apostasy laws and public order laws that have been used to harass members of religious minority groups. Uzbekistan's government has released hundreds of people who had been imprisoned because of their beliefs. Just this past Saturday, Turkmenistan released 16 Jehovah's Witnesses who are conscientious objectors and refused to serve in the military. We understand the authorities will now offer conscientious objectors alternative ways to meet national service requirements. We want to see more progress like that. And so our promise to the world is that the Biden-Harris administration will protect and defend religious freedom around the world. We will maintain America's long-standing leadership on this issue. We're grateful for our partners, including like-minded governments, the UN Human Rights Council, and networks like the International Religious Freedom of Belief Alliance and the International Contact Group of Freedom of Religion or Belief. We'll continue to work closely with civil society organizations, including human rights advocates and religious communities, to combat all forms of religiously motivated hatred and discrimination around the world.
Good morning. And Eid Mubarak to all of our Muslim friends celebrating the end of Ramadan. Thank you, Secretary Blinken, for those clear and forceful remarks underscoring our unyielding commitment to promote and defend, let me take this off so you can hear me. To promote and defend freedom of religion or belief for all. I am also very pleased to recognize our reports coordinator, Bob Bohm, and his extraordinary editing team for their efforts to make this year's report, all 2,397 pages, a reality. Today, we release the State Department's 23rd Report on International Religious Freedom. Over the course of more than 2 decades, we are proud to say these reports have become an indispensable resource to governments, legislatures, activists, academics, civil society organizations, and religious communities the world over who value and seek to ensure this fundamental freedom. Our guiding principle in preparing the report is to present all relevant information as objectively, thoroughly, and fairly as possible. And though couched in dry and at times bureaucratic-sounding language, What you see as you delve into the country chapters is a rich fabric of individual stories. Stories that help us understand the experiences of individuals, of communities, sometimes entire societies. These reports include the personal costs, horrifying stories of discrimination, abuse, torture, disappearance, even death, of someone's parent, someone's sibling, someone's son or daughter, for simply trying to organize their lives in accordance with their most basic values and beliefs. You will also see stories of those fighting back, challenging repressive regimes, countering extremist violence, and building coalitions across religious and ethnic divides to combat discrimination, demand rights, and promote shared values of human dignity, mutual respect, and peace. So what do we do with this trove of information? For the United States government, and for the Office of International Religious Freedom, we use it as a starting point for advocacy efforts that span the entire year and beyond. We use it as a baseline to understand whether and how things are getting better or worse in a place, whether past engagement has proven effective or should be recalibrated, and whether the case of a particular individual or community has been resolved or requires further attention. But some might ask, doesn't this take a lot of resources? What does the United States actually get out of this investment? First, the moral imperative is clear. We as a nation benefit immeasurably from the protections granted by our First Amendment, and it is only natural to want others to share in the wealth of that experience. Our efforts to advance international religious freedom are also firmly rooted in this knowledge. Countries that effectively safeguard this and other human rights are more peaceful, stable, prosperous, and more reliable partners of the United States than those that do not. Nations can never achieve their fullest potential when some are excluded from education, healthcare, jobs, and other essentials on account of their innermost beliefs or how they choose to manifest those beliefs. So it has long been recognized that promoting religious freedom is vital to America's national security interests. Let me touch briefly on a few key themes that emerge in this year's report. First, efforts to criminalize forms of speech and expression are an ineffective and in fact counterproductive tool to promote religious harmony or combat intolerance. While blasphemy laws are particularly pernicious, we are also concerned about laws that aim to regulate a person's ability to wear or not wear religious attire or symbols, or laws that criminalize proselytization or limit parents' ability to provide religious education for their children. Second, excessive and onerous government regulation of religion and religious life alienates citizens from their governments and increases the likelihood of individuals resorting to violence to defend their beliefs. Authorities in many countries continue to constrain religious expression through registration laws or restrictions on religious materials. We now increasingly see governments using this same tactic on the internet, where officials closely monitor and heavily censor religious expression online, and arrest or harass those involved in online discourse on religion or belief. We strongly encourage governments to engage religious communities and faith leaders as partners and consult with these communities when contemplating changes to laws or policies that may impact religion or belief. Third, no society, including our own, is immune from the scourge of religious discrimination, whether manifesting as anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hatred, xenophobia, or marginalization of Christians, atheists, or any others. Education and youth-focused programs are vital to promote an understanding of the value and importance of pluralism and mutual respect for all. We remain committed to working with government and civil society partners to tackle problems like hate crimes, discrimination, and religiously motivated violence in ways that do not interfere with freedom of religion and freedom of expression. And finally, we all must remain vigilant for early warnings of possible mass atrocities around the globe. In a few short years, we have seen genocide perpetrated by ISIS against Yazidis, Christians, and other ethnic and religious minorities in northern Iraq and Syria. We have seen mass atrocities, including ethnic cleansing, committed by the Burmese military against Rohingya. It is certainly no coincidence that those behind the recent military coup are among the same people who have led the repression of Burma's ethnic and religious minorities for decades. As one activist recently noted, they have turned those tools on all of us now. And today, we also cannot look away from the ongoing crimes against humanity and genocide the Chinese government is perpetrating against Muslim Uyghurs and members of other ethnic and religious minority groups in Xinjiang. This can be seen as the culmination of decades of repression of religious adherents, from Tibetan Buddhists to Christians to Falun Gong practitioners. We persist in this work because of the unfortunate truth that many of the challenges to religious freedom we see in the world today are structural, systemic, and deeply entrenched. They cannot be solved by quick fixes or breezy slogans, but we must not give up. These challenges demand sustained commitment from all of us who are unwilling to accept hatred, intolerance, and persecution as the status quo. The United States is committed to using all available tools, both positive and punitive, to advance this universal right. For the many people and communities around the world whose stories fill this report, our message today is clear. We see you, we hear you, and we will not rest until you are free to live your lives in dignity and in peace. Thank you very much, and I'll be pleased to take your questions.
Sir, I mean, you talk about religious freedom of all. I mean, a stark example is what is happening in Al-Aqsa Mosque. I think your response, at best tepid thus far, has in a way encouraged the Israeli security forces and so on to keep storming the mosque time and time and time again. Will you call on them not to do that anymore and to allow Palestinian worshippers to go ahead and worship on this last day of Ramadan and tomorrow being the Eid?
Well, thank you very much for your question. And the United States has long supported the status quo agreement around the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount area. The Secretary spoke at length about this issue, and so from a religious freedom perspective, I think there's only one thing that is worth me adding. The only way over the long term to ensure respect for religious freedom for all Jews, Muslims, Christians, Baha'is, all people in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza is to achieve a just and lasting peace. And you can't have respect for human rights when there continues to be conflict. That's always going to be a challenge and always going to be a tension. And so we remain committed to working with all of the parties in the region to get there together.
Oh, yes. At the United Nations today, there was a bit of a side event. I don't know exactly what the terminology is about the situation in Xinjiang, China, which Secretary Blinken just mentioned. Were you disappointed that there weren't more majority Muslim nations participating in that call? And do you think, how do you think the Chinese government would do you think they'll get the message? And if so, how about whether to, change their actions or behavior in that region?
Well, thank you very much for the question. And obviously, the situation in Xinjiang just shocks the conscience. And we do these events. We arrange these activities to ensure that people understand the full scope and scale of the atrocities being committed there. But it's not a popularity contest at the end of the day. It's not about how many countries line up on one side of an issue or the other. That's an effort on the part of the Chinese government to try and demonstrate that there are people who agree with their worldview, but the facts speak for themselves. The facts of the situation, not the views of the United States government, are what will ultimately carry the day. And what I'm talking about is open source satellite information that's been published in many of your publications. What I'm talking about is the testimony of survivors who have escaped from the camps. That, again, have been published by many of you. All of that information is out there. It's available. We're also talking about documents of the Chinese government, the PRC authorities' own documents, sharing information about how they intend to build these camps, how they intend to manage these populations. All of this is out there for everyone to see. So at the end of the day, it is absolutely clear what horrors are taking place in Xinjiang, being perpetrated by the PRC government. And we will continue to speak out because we must. We will continue to work with partners where we can on issues of sanctions, issues of ensuring accountability and justice for the victims. But at the end of the day, it's not how many people show up at an event. It's us getting at that long-term effort to stop these terrible actions and put people in a better place.
Meyer. Do you have a China question, or should we
I
do
do,
it?
yeah.
Okay, we'll come to you right after.
Yeah. Last month, the independent U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom basically urged the administration to not send officials to the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing over the persecution of Uyghur Muslims. Now, State Department has its own report, and I know that it doesn't talk about Olympics, but still, will you agree to the call for a diplomatic boycott? And I just want to squeeze in something about Burma because you mentioned it in your remarks. We know that State Department has taken up several processes for an atrocity determination, and they fell apart. Given what's happening now, is there a fresh effort to take this up and look into the events to declare a genocide, to make a genocide determination or crimes against humanity?
Sure. Well, I'll take your second question on Burma first. The Secretary has committed to a comprehensive review of the atrocities committed against Rohingya in Rakhine State. That process has begun, and it is, in fact, ongoing. The Department will continue to work in the meantime to promote peace, security, and respect for the human rights of Rohingya as equal citizens of Burma. On your first question about the Beijing Olympics, look, we can't turn a blind eye to Beijing's aberrant human rights record. And it's not just about Xinjiang, which we've spoken about. It's Tibet, it's Hong Kong, it's the whole host of things that happen on the mainland. But we recognize that when it comes to the Olympics, our efforts will be most effective if we act alongside like-minded partners. So at the moment, we're reviewing options on policy and messaging related to the Games that will advance U.S. priorities, which includes countering Beijing's intent to use the Games as a platform to somehow validate their governing model and paper over their gross human rights violations. So we're consulting with Congress, allies and partners, and other key stakeholders as we proceed.
Please.
Just to follow up on China, the U.S. has taken a number of actions against China, including the Commerce Department adding several entities to their entity list, business advisories going out cautioning businesses against forced labor in Xinjiang, numerous officials getting visa restrictions. The Secretary just announced another designation today. Is the State Department seeing any effect to these actions? What more can the State Department do? Is the answer just more officials getting sanctioned?
Well, we're certainly looking at all available options and continuing to look at individual culpability of particular actors in China so we can apply sanctions to them where those sanctions are relevant. In terms of overall, changes or shifts in posture, I think what we've seen over the last year and a half or so is a dramatic shift in the government of China's posture towards this issue of human rights abuses generally. You'll recall that early on it was blanket denial when it came to Xinjiang. There's nothing happening here, nothing to see. Thanks for asking. Sorry. And what that ultimately shifted to was a realization that what was happening could not be denied. It could not be papered over. It was clear. And so now it's about justification. It's about, this is a terrorism issue. Oh, this is this is a security issue. And of course, the world isn't buying it. We see quite clearly what it is. What it is an attempt to erase a people, a history, a culture from the earth, and that's unacceptable. And so we continue to work and look at all the tools at our disposal, and those punitive tools have come in quite handy here. But we're not going to sit back at a certain point and say, okay, that's enough of those. When we find perpetrators, when we find those responsible for activities, whether they've already been committed or if future activities are committed, we're going to continue to hold them accountable under the structure that we've been given in U.S. law.
But just to clarify, there's been no change as far as people in China's religious freedoms.
Well, the situation remains dire, and one of the interesting things that has shifted a bit is, at least early on, you saw dramatic reliance on camps, people being warehoused essentially in camps for re-education, for forced labor, for other purposes. What the government is now doing, they've basically turned Xinjiang into an open-air camp. So people's movements are closely tracked. You have minders who have been assigned to live with Uyghurs to keep tabs on them. You have people going to the market who have to check in every time they go to a different market stall. So what the government has created, it's quite an ambitious effort to essentially turn the entire region into an open-air prison.
Roger.
So, the Secretary said religious freedom is co-equal with other human rights. Religious freedom is not more or less important than other rights. This seems to be a departure from the prior administration. Do you view this as a departure from the prior administration? If so, can you tell us what the thinking was? And also, how much of this report is consistent with what the Trump administration was going to put out? And where are the biggest departures, do you feel, with Biden-Trump administration on this report?
Yeah, so as somebody who's worked on this report now over 3 administrations, I can tell you the structure of the report and the content has changed virtually not at all since amendments to the Religious Freedom Act were passed back in 2016. So the report itself documents the state of religious freedom in nearly 200 countries and territories. It talks about government practices. It talks about laws and policies that are relevant to the state of religious freedom. It talks about societal actions impacting religious freedom. And in the last section, it talks about U.S. government actions to address the challenges that the rest of the report lays out. So nothing has really changed in the Religious Freedom Report from, over the last 3 administrations, essentially since the Wolf Act was passed in 2016. When it comes to the conceptual framework for religious freedom, the Secretary has made clear that religious freedom is a nested human right. It's a human right that exists in codependence with other human rights. You can't have religious freedom without freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. You can't have religious freedom without a system that guarantees the rule of law. Because if people have problems, there's no recourse without a rule of law system. So what you have there is it's not a departure certainly from any prior concept, but it's a clarification because Secretary Pompeo did express his view that there was perhaps a hierarchy of rights concept. And that's a view that this administration does depart from. But that in no way is to indicate that religious freedom is any less important. Religious freedom is in our First Amendment. It's been a part of our country, our culture, our history from the very, very beginning. And it was, in fact, the reason many people came to this country because they were fleeing forms of religious persecution or discrimination overseas. That was true in the 18th century. It continues to be true in the 21st century. So as a general matter, religious freedom is a fundamental freedom. It is a co-equal right, and it's one that we will continue to stand up for.
Yes, please.
Thank you. 2 on India and 1 on South Asia. What is your general assessment of the situation of religious freedom in India? Your report in India does mention that U.S. officials last year discussed with Indians 2 issues, CAA and FCRA. What were you asking India to do on those 2 issues? And finally, your report also mentioned about the religious persecution against Hindus, Christians, and Sikhs in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Afghanistan. What is your message to these 3 countries? Thank you.
Sure thing. Well, with respect to India first, we do regularly engage with Indian government officials at all levels, encouraging them to uphold human rights obligations and commitments, including the protection of minorities, in keeping with India's long tradition of democratic values and its history of tolerance. We also meet continuously with civil society organizations, local religious communities to hear their views and understand challenges and opportunities that they see. When it comes to our overall encouragement to the government of India, it is to engage these communities, these outside actors, in direct discourse. Because when laws are passed, when initiatives are undertaken that are done without effective consultation with these communities, it creates a sense of disempowerment, at times of alienation. And the best way to address that is to engage in that direct dialogue between government and civil society, including religious communities. So with respect to India, I think there's genuine opportunities there for the government to address some of the concerns they hear from Indian civil society through greater dialogue and engagement. When it comes to the other countries you mentioned, I apologize. You mentioned Bangladesh and
Pakistan, Afghanistan.
Sure. So the issues of respect for the rights of Hindu minorities and, in each of those three instances, Christian, sometimes Baha'i, other Sikh, other religious minorities in all three of those countries are of significant interest to us. They're topics that we raise frequently with governments. Sometimes, we're encouraging governments to do the same thing that I mentioned for India. Engage in direct discourse with these communities. Make sure you understand their needs, what opportunities exist to bring them into conversations, and empower them as co-equal citizens. One of the broad principles that we encourage governments to think about is when you have minority populations that don't have access to the same opportunities, jobs, education that members of the majority community do, you're actually losing the potential for economic growth. You're actually losing out on empowering people to be contributing members of your society. And so discrimination has an economic cost as well. And so that's another feature that we always seek to incorporate into those conversations.